Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Timothy Lee, and I'm a research analyst with Red Cloud Securities. I'm delighted to host a Red Cloud webinar on copper, nickel, and PGM exploration today. We will hear from Stephen Turner, Managing Director of Pivotal Metals. During today's webinar, he will provide an overview and outlook. Then we will take questions. You can type your questions into the chat box at any time, and we will get to as many as we can. Before we kick things off, first we need to discuss a little fine print. During this pivotal webinar, forward-looking statements may be made. I would direct listeners to the company's forward-looking statements disclosure outlined in the Pivotal corporate presentation, and that can be found on the company's website, pivotalmetals.com. For Red Cloud Securities, Inc., I would highlight that this webinar is for information purposes only. It should not be considered a solicitation or a recommendation to buy or sell securities. We note that this call does not consider the particular situation or needs of individual investors. Participants should rely on their own investigation and seek their own professional advice before investing. Please see our most recent research located on the Red Cloud website for specific disclosures pertaining to Pivotal. So we have Pivotal Metals presenting today. As no doubt Stephen will elaborate, Pivotal is appropriately named as the company has done a pivot to a focus on copper, nickel, and PGM projects in Canada. Recently completed a transformative acquisition of the Horden Lake projects in Quebec. Meanwhile, they do have brownfields tin tungsten projects in Spain. With that, I now turn it over to Stephen to update our audience on the company.
Hello, and thank you very much for taking the time on a Friday to listen to the Pivotal Metals story. Extremely excited to share this with you, to listeners, whether North America, Europe, or even if they're extremely keen in Australia as it's early hours there. So I will take the time now to run through Pivotal Metals and hopefully set out to you why we think it's quite a compelling story going forward and with significant news flow and upside for shareholders. The forward disclaimer notice that Tim mentioned is here, and we'll sort of move on here to the investment case for Pivotal Metals. Pivotal Metals has recently built, we think, a compelling portfolio in Quebec. We made a very deliberate decision around a year ago to consider where we are best placed to put the very important capital that we raise on the ASX, where we're best to place it, where the best value is for shareholders. And we made the conscious decision to focus more on Quebec going forward. We like Quebec as a tier one jurisdiction. It offers tremendous incentives for the development of critical metals. And not only from a permitting side, but also from various financial incentives. We deliberately focus on copper, nickel, and PGMs. I won't go into the various forecasts around those metals, but those of you that follow the electric vehicle market, the transition to sustainable economies, the desire to build up green hydrogen, etc., will recognize that copper, nickel, and PGMs are actually fundamental to that transition. And that's where we're looking to focus. We have built an attractive portfolio, finalized with the recent acquisition of Horden Lake, that brings together a high impact, very exciting exploration ground at the Belleterre Angliers Greenstone Belt with a well-defined battery metals deposit in Horden Lake. So we think a balanced and exciting portfolio. And on top of that, we have a very active program ahead of us, which will generate significant news flow. A quick look at the company. It's been listed on the ASX since 2018. It's headquartered in Brisbane. We hold projects in Canada and Spain. We did set out in Spain, and we hold a portfolio in Spain of tin and tungsten. But as Tim mentioned, we have looked to pivot towards Canada. And I'll come on to our strategy around Canada and Spain over the course of this presentation. We have, as at the end of the December, we have about $2.5 million in cash. That's followed from a capital raise that we did in December, when we raised 3.3 million in cash as part of the process to complete the acquisition of Horden Lake. So Horden Lake, we closed on the 20th of December, where we paid both cash and shares for the completion of that transaction, and has left us with a healthy cash balance going forward. ESG, certainly an area of extreme importance for us. We are unusual amongst the Australian juniors that we have released a baseline environmental report that is disclosed along the World Economic Forum guidelines or the framework. That is reflective of our focus on environmental and social governance. We have built up really a strong focus on that by operating in Spain, where there's intense scrutiny on projects that you look to develop. And we're taking that focus over to Canada, where we'll continue to make sure that we engage with local community stakeholders, the Cree, who are in the area of our projects, and make sure that we're looking to develop environmentally friendly projects. Horden Lake has some significant characteristics around that, which I'll come on to, that make it a very attractive project from an ESG perspective. So let me go on to Horden Lake. Horden Lake is, as I mentioned, a project is transformative that we acquired, completed at the 20th of December. It has a pit-constrained resource under JORC compliant guidelines of 28 million tons at a 1.5% copper equivalent. That project, that mineral resource estimate was completed in November based on an extensive amount of data that we acquired when we acquired this asset, which covers 52,000 meters of drilling, as well as a preliminary metallurgical report. All that data we hold. We engaged a company called Carrickle Creek that's been associated with Horden Lake for some time, since 2002. They actually ran a 2008 drilling program, and that's a picture of it there on the screen, and also a drilling campaign in 2012, as well as having written a 43101 report in 2009. So they're very familiar with the project, very familiar with the area, and we engaged them and took that data and had a new report, resource estimate produced. And I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail. But let me first of all highlight the location and some of the attraction of this from a more logistical perspective. So Horden Lake is located in the northwest of Quebec. It's located 18 kilometers from the Bruce Highway that runs, the James Bay Highway, sorry, that runs from Le Grand Power Station down to Matagami. That road has recently completed a major upgrade, a $300 million upgrade. It has fiber optic cables. It's got high voltage power lines that run from the hydroelectric station to the north, which gives us the opportunity to develop a zero carbon or low carbon footprint mine. Passing within 18 kilometers of the site gives us access, very good access to that infrastructure, and allows us to have access to an all-weather airport to the north, the Matagami mining town to the south, where we can source labs and people, and also access to smelters in the area. The acquisition of the claims, 18 claims, you can see in the bottom left-hand side. What's important on this particular slide or this photo is that you can see the outline of the resource. It was discovered in the 1960s by Inco with 32,000 meters of drilling. They focused on nickel and copper only at the time. And the latter drill campaigns that I've mentioned already in 2008 and 2012 really were focused more in the northeast of the deposit. And they undertook multi-element assays. And in those assays, and we'll see some cross sections of those, you'll see that there's significant quantities of gold, silver, palladium, and cobalt. And this really transforms this deposit into a multi-element deposit that has a number of very, very attractive commodities in it, as well as obviously the copper and nickel. If we look at that resource estimate, you can see it's a 42 million ton deposit from a geological deposit. Although when we start applying the cutoff grades and the pit constrained shell around it, we get to 28 million tons, which equates to about a 0.7-0.8% cutoff. The picture on the right-hand side shows what the model looks like. You'll see the concentration on the left-hand part of that of where the gold and the palladium and copper, cobalt, etc. is identified. As a result of that, we are not able to ascribe all these different commodities or precious metals across the whole resource. So the graph on the left-hand side, you can see it's about 50% copper, 40% nickel, and then the remaining 10% is made up of palladium and gold. Now, the palladium represents 167,000 ounces of palladium, the gold about 65,000 ounces of gold, but that gold only covers about 40% of the deposit. And as a result of that, if you were to gross that up, that would take it to about 165,000 ounces of gold as well. There's no silver in there. There's no cobalt in there. And we'll look at the cross sections to see there's very good grades. We just didn't have the data points to assign that. So the balance of the deposit comprises about 200,000 tons of copper and 62,000 tons of nickel to get us to that 1.49% copper equivalent that you see here in the pit constraint. So the 55% of the resource sits in indicated with 45% in inferred. The deposit is a very neat, tidy deposit in two lodes. The main lode extending down as far as 600 meters deep. There's a pit that's a shell that's been put over it that extends to nearly 200 meters, and then the balance of it is picked up as underground. You'll see from this next slide that there's a cross section from the Inco drill holes. The deposit sits at about a 55-degree angle, which means that when you overlay a pit shell, it actually picks up most of that resource anyway, being 55 degrees being similar to what the angle of the pit shell walls are. The resource is open along strike to the northeast and to the southwest, and also at depth, which offers tremendous additional upside. In fact, I'm just going to back up to this particular slide. The right-hand picture of that model, you can see that when we go back and drill in this year, and I'll come on to the drill program, the drill targets that we're looking at are very much in that more barren area where it's only nickel and copper has been assayed for by Inco in the 1960s. So we're going to go out and re-drill in many of those areas and assay for cobalt, silver, etc. So we can incorporate that into the mineral resource estimate. So we think our 1.5% copper equivalent has significant ability to be increased. And we're also going to put some deeper holes down in some high-grade zones. So we think that we'll be adding some significant tonnage as well as we go through this coming drill program. If we now look at the El Condor holes, which were drilled in 2012, this is a cross-section right up at the northeast of the resource, so right at the edge of the resource. And you can see the very high grades that are being encountered at the edge of the resource of, 2.75% copper is really quite exceptional, 0.45 nickel. But you were also getting 200 to 300 parts per million cobalt. We're getting 20 to 40 grams of silver. And none of that cobalt or silver has yet been incorporated into the resource estimate. So really some tremendous upside for us just by going back and drilling some of those areas where we know the resource already sits. So before I go on, so the program that we're looking at on the Horden Lake over the next 12 months is about going back and drilling very selectively into that resource and targeting those areas where we haven't got multi-element assays, some deeper drill holes, and then we'll move on and do metallurgical test work and some baseline studies. I'll come on to that on our timeline going forward, but very much driven towards the delivery of a PFS. Now, the other asset that is really exciting for us in this portfolio, and I shouldn't understate it because it really is, offers some tremendous upside, is the Belleterre Angliers Greenstone Belt. We acquired our first claims in the end of 2020, called the Midram and La Force claims. And then in May of last year, we consolidated that position by doubling our our claims area with the acquisition of Alata and Lorraine. Now, this is an area in the southwest of Quebec, highly mineralized. The tenors I'll come on to at the next slide, you'll see are very, very high. But I think if we just look at this is another gabbroic intrusive area, massive sulphide mineralization with substantial amount of drilling on it. I mean, there's been 14,000 meters of drilling on the La Force claims. There's been 25,000, 30,000 meters of drilling on Midrim. There's been an extensive amount of drilling, which has all been shallow, and it's found very high grades. And that's the same with Alata and Lorraine, that demonstrates the mineralization of this area. But what it hasn't done, and nobody has done previously, is they've never focused on the deeper areas. And our review of the geological model suggests that this shallow mineralization is indicative of a larger feeder system sitting lower down. When we acquired all these claims, we did a review of the data that was there. There's been VTEMs flown over all the properties, all recent VTEMs, 2019 and 2021. And we've identified around 70 shallow anomalies, and about 20 high of those, about 20 of them are high priority. But when we went back in and reprocessed some of this data and looked deeper in line with our geological model, we've identified 137 additional EM anomalies, with a further 20 classified as priority 1. So what we have is a highly mineralized area with some really interesting prospectivity. And you can see from these intercepts, the first 3 relate to the Midrim claims area. And you can see, intercepts of up to 6% nickel, over 5% copper, high amounts of platinum group elements, and also the same in the Alata, which is immediately to the south of Midrim. And in some of the anomalies that we've identified in the Midrim claims area actually extend into the Alata. So this consolidation that we did back in May, we think has been a tremendous opportunity for us to really take a commanding position in what looks to be a very exciting province. So the upside on this is, we think, is considerable. The program that we have lined up, having done a lot of desktop reprocessing across all of these assets, is that we'll look to proceed with some acoustic MT surveys that will give us 3D images down to about 1,200 meters, and some low frequency MT surveys. And that will be the initial step. And we've got a number of drill ready targets and Maxwell plates already modeled. So there are drill ready targets for us. So we'd look to do a very limited drilling campaign initially, but really the focus is more on the MT surveys and really targeting those where we think those deeper plays may be. So Belleterre Angliers, we think, is a very, very exciting prospect and highly complementary to the advanced exploration or near-term development project of Horden Lake. I'll just touch on the Spanish assets. Now, Spain is the area that we started off. We started off with the Santa Comba project. It's got an underground permit. We've gone in and focused very much on an open pit opportunity. And we produced last year a pre-feasibility study around that, which showed quite an interesting and exciting project. We acquired Finx a year ago. Finx is a high-grade underground mine. It's already permitted. It was last operating in 2017. It's got a process plant there of 72,000 tons per annum. It does require some additional capex to bring it back online. The key impediment to that time was the requirement for the award of a water permit. And we announced that just recently that water permit was awarded. So that has unlocked the Finx mine. And what it's done is it's allowed us to progress with our strategy to bring in third-party funding to take these projects through to production. The important thing here is that we, as a company, recognize that as a junior, we have access to capital is tough, and we need to be very careful where we allocate that. And as a board, we've decided that Canada offers the greatest opportunity. And so the capital we raise at the Pivotal Metals level will be allocated to Canada. and any further capital that we want to allocate into Finx and Santa Comba to take those through to production, which we're very keen to see happen, will be provided by third parties coming in through some form of corporate deal at the Spanish level. So we are in discussions with a number of parties. We are looking to effectively divest down our position, whether that's through simple dilution or some other means, and to see that those projects are taken forward so that going forward as a company, we will be very much dedicated and focused as a Canadian battery metals player with these exciting assets in Quebec. So if we look at the 2023 program going forward, there's a lot of news catalysts coming, a lot of information flow. There's the drilling program. There's the environmental baseline studies will kick off. Metallurgical test work that has benefited from an existing study that we've been able to review, and therefore has given us very good direction as to where we need to focus our metallurgical test work going forward. That will lead to an updated JORC mineral resource estimate and a PFS, a pre-feasibility study, in early 2024. With the Belleterre Angliers exploration projects, we'll be looking to undertake the MT surveys and some limited drilling, which we also believe will bring some exciting news flow. And to facilitate this, we'll be looking at some point, a flow-through share issuance to support this program going forward. The reason being is that's a much more capital-efficient way for us to fund exploration expansion. For those on the call who are familiar with Canada and the flow-through share issuance scheme, you'll recognize that this is a fantastic way to get money to invest in the ground and minimize dilution for shareholders, given a significant uplift. And this is one of the main reasons, or one of the reasons, why we've been so excited to invest in Quebec, given some of these ancillary benefits that come from that. And ultimately, it is only natural that a company that has its primary assets or its focus in Canada, that we would look to investigate some sort of listing on the TSX. That's later in the year. We'll have an investigation into that and see if it makes sense. But in doing so, it'll obviously open up access to greater capital investment from the Quebec government funds, etc. So it would appear to be a natural progression, but it will be subject to some review later in the year once these programs are underway. So for us, why invest in Pivotal Metals? Well, in summary, we've built a very exciting portfolio in Quebec that's underpinned by a number of recent transactions. So in July of last year, there was the acquisition of the Le Grasset 1.53 nickel equivalent 5 million ton deposit by Archer for 54 million Canadian. And I think only just a few days ago, Anglo has announced a $24 million investment into Canadian nickel. So we can see transactions happening now that really demonstrate the value and the potential of these sort of deposits in this region. So we've got a large, well-defined project in Horden Lake. We've got the upside from the Belleterre and the blue sky from the Belleterre Angliers exploration play. We think this makes us quite a compelling and a differentiated company from many of the other exploration type players in Quebec that you see on the markets. So we would certainly believe quite strongly that with the news flow and the assets we've put in place, that we offer some tremendous upside for those who want to follow the story and invest in us. So that concludes the presentation as it stands at the moment. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I believe the floor will then be opened up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, for a very informative presentation. As Stephen mentioned, we'll now start the Q&A portion of the webinar. Just a reminder to everyone on the line, you can type your questions into the chat box at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can. First, a couple of questions on Horden Lake. What is the overburden depth before you reach the hard rock of the deposit?
It's about 30 meters. It's fairly shallow. It runs down to, as I say, the average depth of the deposit is 144 meters. Like I say, it's quite actually a compact deposit. The average width of the deposit is about 14 meters. And so it runs in a north, south, east, west trend, but there's very limited overburden. In fact, it comes actually quite close to service in some parts. In the northeast section, it actually comes very close to service. So there's not an awful lot of overburden. That's one of the reasons we've looked at an open pit scenario to start off with. What the PFS would look to determine is whether we do build an open pit and then go underground, or whether we go straight to underground, or whether do some sort of hybrid. And that's one of the main questions that we'll be looking to address through the PFS study.
Okay, great. What is the budget for the Quebec projects individually for 2023?
So the budget at the moment for the entire PFS is around 3.5 million Canadian. Okay, and obviously that is subject to the results of the metallurgical test work. Metallurgical test work, for those involved, will know that it's a little bit of a how long is a piece of string. Until you get your results back, you need to then run more tests. But our initial estimate is around 3.5 million Canadian, and the Belleterre Angliers will be about 500,000.
Okay, great. And when will you had mentioned that you're looking at a TSX at a Canadian listing, but would the company also list its shares on a U.S. stock exchange?
Oh, look, we haven't considered that at the moment. I think the more logical route for us would be in Canada. That's where our focus is, our attention, and obviously funds in Australia, in the US are quite comfortable investing on the Canadian exchanges. So, I think we'd need to understand if there's a compelling reason to list in the US. Certainly, as a junior, we wouldn't want to be on too many exchanges. There's no real added benefit for that.
Sure. And you had mentioned the Cree First Nation at Horden Lake. Do you have a formal agreement in place, or are you working toward an impact benefits agreement with them?
Right. So first of all, Horden Lake sits on Crown land. Okay. So first and foremost, there is not a requirement to negotiate any formal agreement with the Cree. However, we are looking to work with them. For example, on the drilling campaign that we're going to look to do, we look to engage with them to manage the mobile camps, etc. So we are looking to engage and work with the Cree and give them obviously access to employment and opportunity and work there, which is only proper and correct. But there's no, but they are on Crown lands.
Okay, great. One question, a little open-ended here, but anytime you have a project that's had some historic work, folks wonder why did Horden Lake not advance to, why did Inco not build a mine there previously?
Yeah, that is a good question. The highway that runs from the La Grande power station was only constructed in the 1970s. This deposit was discovered in the 1960s. It was remote. It was only accessible by float or helicopter. The focus of Inco at the time was nickel and copper only, and so then the numbers just didn't stack up. Roll forward all these years, 50 years, or 60 years even, and what you have is a scenario where these commodities, copper, nickel, are in high demand. Prices strengthened substantially. We've now understand that there's substantial amount of byproduct credits in the precious metals, the cobalt, the silver, gold, and palladium in particular, which has enhanced the value of the asset significantly. And of course, there's that James Bay Highway that now runs within 18 kilometers of the property. So the asset from when it was originally discovered and explored to today has materially changed. The commodities, the pricing, the infrastructure, and all that has materially changed to the extent that now it's a very exciting project that you can see being taken all the way through to production.
Great. And similarly for the Belleterre Angliers properties, obviously there was a substantial amount of historic drilling. What's prevented past operators from advancing that further?
So the previous owners have normally looked for a quick news flow. All right. So what they've done is there's been extensive drilling, but what we find is a lot of it's been twin drilling. They've put down a hole in a known mineralized area, They've announced it and look to get some benefit on the market from it. But what nobody has done is nobody's taken a holistic view or sort of more of a wider regional view on these mineralizations. And this is what we've looked to do. And nobody has looked at any mineralization below about 250 or 300 meters. There are a lot of small, high-grade pods in this project. And in fact, there are previous mines. The Lorraine had a mine in the 1960s. It mined out 660,000 tons with very good grades. It had 0.38% nickel, 0.9% copper, okay? And it also had associated gold, platinum group elements, and cobalt in there. All right. Right within the middle of our deposits, although not within our claims, is the Lac Kelly. And in 2017, the Globex released an estimate of the resource of 1.2 million tons of 0.7 copper, 0.7 nickel, and 1.3 grams per ton of platinum palladium. So very high grade, but shallow, relatively small deposits. Okay, and so people have looked at making these work, but they're spread around and they're relatively small. So you need to get access to processing plants, make it worthwhile to set up and ship. So really, never a consolidated play, never one that's really driven a proper study and development program. Now, when we look at this, we have not acquired these projects for these shallow mineralized pods. We've acquired these projects because we believe these shallow pods are indicative of a much larger play deeper down. And so far, our study work and our VTEM reprocessing indicates some incredibly interesting anomalies that we want to continue to pursue.
Great. One question here, and you had mentioned the recent investment by Anglo American. We've seen quite a bit of interest by various strategic groups from major mining companies to automobile companies to battery companies invest in battery metals projects. Would you be open to that, or is that something that you've explored?
Look, we are interested in talking to strategic investors. There's no doubt about that. This is a project. It's a sizable deposit, is Horton Lake. It's going to require significant capex to take it all the way through into production. Obviously, that's going to be done over stages as we take it through a PFS and a DFS, etc. But ultimately, to take this into production is going to require a large amount of capital cost, a large amount of capital investment. And therefore, bringing on a strategic investor that can help us with that journey and help support us through to production is something we would always be open to.
Great. And one question following up on that. What is the long-term strategy for the company? Would you look to become a mining company, or would you look to advance the project through Horton Lake through development and then sell to a producer?
Right. Well, we always, need to put first and foremost the interest of the shareholders. My background is development. Right. I've been 30 years in the industry, focused on developments rather than really exploration, and so I'm very comfortable looking to take these projects through to development. Having said that, I also don't believe that you dress something up for a sale. I think the best way to take something through and make it attractive to others is to actually advance it in the best way possible through to production. That means that if in taking it through to production, someone comes along and makes a compelling offer, we'll always be open to that. Our primary driver is to make the money for the shareholders. If it means that we have to continue through to production, we're also happy to do that. So, we will continue with our strategy to take this project all the way through to development. And if something comes along the way that makes sense, we will obviously consider it.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions we have. I guess one kind of general question you had mentioned in the slides, but kind of to finish off, just to review, what are some of the key milestones and kind of key news that we might expect from the company in the coming months?
Okay, so thank you. We have lined up a pretty detailed program. All right, so we are in discussions with a drilling contractor, which we've got basically more or less agreed the terms. ready to move forward. We've got the permits in for the wetlands and the forestry permits with a detailed drill program lined up. We've got metallurgical labs lined up. We've got the program and the scope fully set out. We have the Belleterre Angliers program fully designed with where the MT surveys will take place. So we're really quite ready to move forward with a significant amount of activity over the next 12 months, with the goal, particularly around Horden Lake, of getting a PFS out in early 2024. So that will naturally lead to a number of interesting and important announcements as we go. All of them should be demonstrating significant value accretion for shareholders as we de-risk the project and we move it clearly forward to the next stage. So look, there's a very active program over the next 12 months, and as set out in that timeline on those slides, which we think means that there'll be some good news flow and fairly regular news flow over the 12 months.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank Stephen Turner for presenting today, and thank you everyone on the line for tuning in. Just a reminder that Red Cloud Securities will be back next Wednesday when our webinar series continues with Renforth Resources presenting Wednesday, February 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Have a great rest of your day.